Good morning, all. Today we'll be discussing about Mikhail Baktin and Dialogism. So let's get started. First of all, who is Mikhail Baktin? Mikhail Baktin was a Russian philosopher, literary critic, and a scholar who worked on literary theory, ethics, and philosophy of language. Although Baktin was active in debates on aesthetic and literature that took place in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, his distinctive position did not become well known until he was rediscovered by the Russian scholars in 1960. That is, he was not famous uh, before as he was a scholar, but then he was rediscovered by the Russian scholars in 1960. His works appeared in English decades after he wrote them in 1920s and 1930s. He also proposed dialogue as the intrinsic feature of language. So Bakhtin proposed dialogue as the intrinsic feature of language. While Bakhtin himself never used the term dialogism, it has been associated with his works and is most recognizable concept from his oeuvre. In order to understand his works on the novel, that is narrator, it is important to look at his notion of dialogue. There are few key terms in Baktin thought that have been to be understood, namely dialogue, heteroglossia, chronotop, and carnival. So we'll be discussing these four in detail. That is Baktin's teachings. First, let's move on to dialogue. Dialogue. Dialogue is a differential relation, and dialogue always implies a relationship. In any conversation, the speaker are different from each other. But what is interesting is that these differences are retained in the conversation. They are held in place in the relation which is the dialogue. Dialogue is imposed upon us. We do not set out to engage in dialogue. Bakhtin believed the existence of mutual difference that enabled dialogue. Bakhtin thought that if two persons have mutual differences, then that enabled the dialogue. Bakhtin was therefore focusing on self or other aspects of all language, where there is always the other within my speech. In fact, my speech anticipates and prepares for others' response. Bakhtin begins by assuming that literary texts, especially novels, are utterances in a given context of a text production. Dialogism has already told us that meaning in any utterances is based on the social context. Indeed, the context is what makes us understand the words themselves. I hope you understood what is dialogism. Next, let us move on to heteroglossia. What is heteroglossia? Bakhtin proposes that the novels are prime examples of what he calls heteroglossia. Heteroglossia is a simultaneity of many levels of dialogue and language. The subject about to make an utterance can pick one responses out of the mass languages around him or her. The other voice is given much importance as the selves. In the case of novels, if we take Bakhtin's example as Dostoevsky, the many voices are given equal importance, thereby showing the novel as a site of struggle, carnival, and subversion. Working class discourses, women's languages, the language of ethnic minorities are all represented alongside that of the dominant one. Now that was all about heteroglossia. Now let's move on to Chronotop. Bakhtin further proposed a novel often renders in an artistic way that interconnected of spatial and temporal relationship. Space and time are interconnected. In plots are central to the narrative or plot. The interconnected aspect is what he terms chronotop. Every age has its own notion of space and time, and therefore chronotops are rooted in the local conditions. In the 20th century, after Einstein, science and the developments in the physics, we have a different sense of space and time. Chronotops in science fiction today therefore suggest multiple worlds whose time zones are also multiple. Baktin, as we can see, is a keen on showing how the novel is a form of inherently heteroglossic, giving space to many voices. The novel resists monologic and situates language and discourses alongside each other. That was about Chronotop. Now the last one, Carnival. Baktin evidently was attempting to find literary examples where the power was subverted. In order to do so, he outlined a concept of the carnival, that is a reading of the works of Rabelais. So carnival was laugher, the boldly, the parody, the ugly, the grotesque, and also the so-called low. Boldly functions are the part of carnival because they do not find expression in official cultures. Clowning, again, not a part of official culture, is also a key element in the carnival. Carnival is a useful mode of discussing popular or mass culture because Bhaktin is essentially speaking of the need to subvert and integrate established or institutional authority over meaning. We see instances of the carnival in the writings of Salman Rushdie. If we look at the example of Midnight Children by Salman Rushdie believes that the Indo-Pakistan War of 1965 happened because he imagined it. Here Rushdie is reducing a massive event to a single individual fantasy. There is nothing remarkable in the situation of war. It all exists in the person's mind. This is the carnivalesque because it subverts a so-called national event and transforms it to a mundane act of daydreaming and adolescent fantasy. See, so that is the example of carnival. Uh, so I think you all have understood, and now it's time for me to wind up. So these were the four teachings of uh, teachings. Now that is Carnival, Chronotop, Heteroglossia, and Dialogue. So here I'm going to end my session. Thank you and have a nice day.